On debates and Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, we are on the brink of voting on Bill C-45, a bill to legalize cannabis use at second reading. First of all, I would like to say that as soon as this election commitment was made in June 2015 and announced by the Prime Minister, my first reaction was one of surprise. Why? How is it that cannabis legalization became a priority for our society? And above all, why is the solution to back down in the face of this problem? Why is that the solution? I've always believed in the decriminalization of simple possession, and I've wanted to avoid having youth being stigmatized with a criminal record for a minor offense. I still believe in this today, when our knowledge of this subject is refining increasingly since the beginning of our debates, but the government wants to go further and become the first country in the world to legalize the free sale of cannabis, even by trying to demonstrate the greatest openness possible. This desire to legalize things so quickly concerns me a great deal in a number of ways. I will try to share the issues raised by Bill C-45 objectively and practically. By legalizing cannabis use in the hurried way proposed without scientific assessment and against all the advice of medical experts, the government is flouting a basic standard of a public modern decision maker, the principle of precaution of healthy public administration. Internationally admitted, this principle was even constitutionalized in 2015 by France as a non-starter for any piece of legislation. The principle of precaution designates a situation in which knowledge is insufficient to scientifically establish the existence of a risk of great harm due to a human activity susceptible to affect the environment, public health, or food security. Here, the human activity in question is the use of cannabis, a product that is consumed by humans, we need to remember. This principle is found elsewhere in Canada in some judicial decisions and was incorporated into the Consumer Safety Act. This bill, C-45, will profoundly change our society. And the speed at which it is being conducted is troubling. And when we say speed, we also mean improvisation. The Minister of Health tells us that the Act will be implemented 8 to 12 weeks after royal assent is given to Bill C-45. To compare, in the American states that legalize cannabis use, a legalization that was decided upon by referendum, I should mention, it was 12 to 24 months after the bill was passed that it came into effect. Colorado passed its act to legalize cannabis use on December 10th, 2012, and sales started 12 months later on January 1st, 2014. In Washington State, the law was passed on December 5th, 2012, and sales started only 18 months later, namely July 8th, 2014. And finally, in California, the law was passed November 9th, 2016, and sales started 13 months later on January 1st, 2018. And Uruguay took 4 years of preparation before making cannabis accessible through a network of pharmacies. In this way, local police and health administrations had much more time to prepare, without mentioning the fact that they already had 10 to 15 years of experience in random drug testing among public transporters and drivers and high-risk workers like airline pilots, train engineers, bus drivers, and so on and so forth. Despite all this, the representatives of these American states told us that when the bill's entry into effect occurred, they realized that they really hadn't prepared enough. And now, and we, a country 37 times as large as Colorado, are doing this in 8 weeks. Are we really serious? We have heard from the governments of the provinces, police forces, medical specialists, and many other organizations begging the federal government to slow down the pace at which this important transformation happens so that it can be done in an orderly fashion. Whatever you might think about Bill C-45, I must admit that it has a certain instructive effect by triggering a national dialogue on cannabis. For example, we know that a growing number of Canadians believe that people should not have a criminal record for possession of a small amount of cannabis. Furthermore, some objectives of Bill C-45 are laudable. There seems even to be a consensus on them. It is always useful to highlight that what both parties have in common, and I'll cite three things. The following statements made by the Department of Justice at second reading reflect the intentions of Bill C-45. 1. To protect the health of youth by limiting their access to cannabis. 2. To lighten the burden on the criminal justice system. 3, to raise the public about the risks associated, the health risk associated with cannabis use. End of quote.
Fascinating.
What is fascinating is that despite the universal agreement on these three intentions, there are also positions between them for the for, the against, and the maybes, but only on this condition. Why? The answer is simple, and it seems to be in the execution of these three good intentions. In other words, how can Bill C-45 reach its objectives, and is legalization the only option for reaching the government's objectives?
A piece of good news is the fact that the primary reason for proposing Bill C-45 no longer exists. We now know, thanks to the December 2017 report by Statistics Canada and the 2017 UN drug report, Canada does not have one of the highest cannabis use in the world, in particular amongst youth. This is very encouraging. In fact, according to StatCan, between 2002 and 2012, the percentage of 15 and 17 years old reporting past year use decline, and usage amounts 18 and 25 remain unchanged. This was also confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer report on the fiscal consideration regarding cannabis. It's just it. Historical data from the Youth Smoking Survey indicated that a consistent and substantial decline in reported youth cannabis consumption in recent years.
Really good.
To prepare Bill C-45, the government struck a working group which published a report in December 2016.
First, I think this 90-page report is helpful, even if it wasn't objective, but it was no fault of the task force, since members were only fulfilling their objectives as mandated by the government. Now it is a thorough report when compared to the 800-page 2002 Senate report and the 1,000-page Obledin Commission. In fact, the task force report is not even scholarly. For instance, an example out of scholarly government report is the 2015 paper titled Alcohol Consumption in Canada by the Chief Public Health Officer, who at the time was Dr. Gregory Taylor. This study is a half size of the task force report, and yet he has 705 citations. Whereas the task force report has 0, with no bibliography. The reason this matters is because the task force report was used to draft Bill C-45. If the task force report lacks of credibility, then we need to consider it if it's also true for the bill itself. Because as the Minister of Justice said to the Committee of the Whole, and I quote, the government was informed in large part by the advice it received from the task force. Revenons au groupe de travail.
Let's get back to the working group. To its credit, the report recognizes the gaps in our current knowledge on cannabis and the effects of cannabis on human health and development. They recognized that the cannabis policy in its many dimensions had not been the subject of exhaustive and high-quality research in a number of fields. On the many subjects, it noted that the proof was often non-existent, incomplete, or inconclusive.
Here and ask you, what would happen if a pharmacological company said the same things to the Canadian Health Products and Food Branch, the governing body that reviews drug application? Just imagine a pharmacological company presenting its new drug to the FDA and then conclude by saying, even though the evidence for the efficacy of this new drug is non-existent, incomplete, and even inconclusive. We would like the FDA to approve sales of our drug across Canada without a required prescription, and for convenience, allow people to buy it online? Perhaps a member of the FDA will simply smile and say, you are aware that you cannot even buy codeine cough syrup without a prescription. Come back to us once you have performed clinical trials. You may be asking yourself right now, why then did Health Canada approve cannabis? The short answer is, they did it. In a document titled Information for Healthcare Professionals Regarding Cannabis Use, which contained 1,000 citations, the document begins with a disclaimer in bold print. Cannabis is not an approved therapeutic product, and the provision of this information should not be interpreted as an endorsement of the use of this product or cannabis generally by Health Canada. Fin de la citation. Here is something else that was not mentioned in the House but was addressed by the task force. The member acknowledged that, and I quote, it is more appropriate to refer to our recommendation as evidence-informed rather than evidence-based. And yet, the Minister of Justice introduced bill by stating, our government understands the complexity of the legalization of cannabis. That is why we have taken a cautious, evidence-based approach. But clearly, the task force advised the government not to use the expression evidence-based. Again, in the same speech, she reiterated the fact that our government believes in evidence-based policy. And then, in the response to a question, she said, and I quote, C-45 is an evidence-based piece of legislation that seeks to put in the complex regime to legalize and strictly regulate cannabis in this country, and is the base of Substances Task Force report. Dans son discours à l'ONU en 2016,
in her speech to the UN in 2016, the Minister of Health stated that, and I quote, that our drug approach will be global, collaborative, and compassionate. Global means exhaustive in this case. You will recall that the working group wrote, our recommendations reflect the fact that the current scientific understanding of the weakening of faculties by cannabis has gaps, and that more research on the evidence, investment, tools, and public education are necessary and urgently needed. The president of the working group said that they discovered that the regulation of cannabis affects all aspects of society, and indicated in the other conclusions of the report that science is not definitive on a safe age for cannabis use. On page 17, there is consensus on the need for pursuing research to understand, validate, and approve cannabis-based medications. On page 6, we know more about the short-term effects of cannabis use. We are less certain about some of its more long-term effects. On page 15.
One of these concerns, then obviously further study will be required. This may explain why Uruguay took 4 years to fully implement their legislation, and distribution is through the network of pharmacies. For whatever reason, the Health Committee did not hear a representative from Uruguay, so I'm curious to learn more about their approach, and in particular what it took them 4 years. If Canada implements Bill C-45 in 8 to 12 weeks, then the only people who will benefit from such an accelerated timeline are big corporations and some unknown stockholder hidden in the tax havens. Revenons maintenant spécifiquement.
Let's get back specifically to Bill C-45. The government is telling us that one of the objectives of this bill is to eradicate organized crime, that is behind the production and sale of cannabis. On which scientific data is the government relying when it legalizes the cannabis use, in thinking that it will attack the activities of organized crime? We don't know. On February 27th, Radio-Canada published a report on cannabis dealers who've been active for a few years. The report highlighted that traffickers are not at all concerned about the future legalization of cannabis. Here is an excerpt from the piece. Resellers say that they're ready to start a price war with the state. Government prices will always be higher because there's more bureaucracy, said Vincent, a cannabis reseller in Montérégie. The drop in the value of cannabis on the black market will not threaten the revenues of street resellers. Mélanie, who has been operating for 30 years in Montreal's downtown, said this: "You have 30 grams, you don't go to jail. When I finish that, I will go to my cachet and I will get another 30 grams. I will continue to sell the same as I've always done." I remind you that in her stash, she has up to 160 grams, and in some provinces, the quantities are even different. That, dear colleagues, can give you a good idea of what we're looking at here. Still concerning organized crime, here is an enlightening comment. Recently, when he appeared before the Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs, Kevin Brosseau, the interim commissioner at the RCMP, questioned the statements made by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and ministers responsible for cannabis legalization within the federal government. They said that it was imperative to legalize the drug to get rid of organized crime from the marijuana black market, which allows them to pocket a fortune. And I quote, "Given the scope of the involvement of organized crime in the illegal cannabis market, we do not expect the bill to eliminate the presence of organized crime in the cannabis market. It will reduce it, but it will not eliminate it." In my opinion, organized crime is constantly evolving, and it always is one step ahead of us. Finally, the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, the SPVM, also shared some doubts about the claims of the Trudeau government, stating that organized crime has already amended its strategies to get around law and order in advance of the legalization of cannabis set for the beginning of July. The spokesperson for the SPVM said the following thing: Organized crime is, as its name indicates, organized. It adjusts to market realities. That's what police officers are saying. Along the same lines, it is a bit paradoxical that the Trudeau government claims to want to remove youth from the hands of organized crime. When cannabis is illegal, we see what the habits of our youth look like. According to a technical report by the Canadian Centre to Address Alcoholism and Drug Addiction, published in 2011, estimates for cannabis use in the last year go from 16.7% to 32.4%. According to the Canadian Inquiry on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drugs among Students for 2014-2015, youth consumption in 10th and 12th grade is at about 28%. This means, honourable senators, that despite the fact that cannabis is currently illegal, people can procure it easily. This isn't a surprise. But what will happen when Bill C-45 is adopted and it still bans the use of cannabis for youth, among youth? These youth who are consuming marijuana today will continue to do so after legalization. Even more so, because the bill opens the door to growing 4 plants in private homes. How can you imagine that youth won't have direct access to them? In the light of these facts, it is utopic to think that youth won't fall into the hands of the illicit market and that their consumption will decrease.
Age limit purchase cannabis. Of the 620 nations, apart from South Africa, Canada has, according to WHO, the worst drunk driving record. This is hard to believe. Part of the reason is due to the legal age to purchase alcohol. According to Ontario's Ministry of Transportation, the peak age of drinking and driving collision are 19, 20, 21, and that drivers in his age group are almost 1.5 times as likely to be involved in drinking and driving fatal and injury crashes than other drivers. Now, it is true that some people are already driving stoned, but keep in mind, in Colorado and Washington state, cannabis-related fatalities since legalization become worse every year. Le projet de loi C-45.
Bill C-45 sets the legal age for cannabis use at 18, leaving open the option to the provinces to raise that age. To date, provinces have set the legal age at 18 or 19. In the United States, all states that legalize cannabis set the legal age at 21. This notion of age is essential. Science indicates that the brain is still growing until the age of 25. Cannabis use before this age is seriously problematic and very dangerous. It is worrisome to read that what the psychiatrists had to say in their briefs presented to the House of Commons during study of Bill C-45, and I quote, "At the clinical level, regular cannabis use among youth translates into attention deficits, memory deficits, processing problems, information processing problems, and intelligence problems. These problems can impact scholastic success. Furthermore, cannabis use increases the risk of developing psychotic issues such as schizophrenia. Psychiatrists, like many specialists, recommend increasing the legal age for cannabis use. Some have spoken about the age of 21. Others say it should rather be set at age 25. Basing ourselves on science, it would be irresponsible to not take into account these recommendations. Furthermore, health professionals also alerted us about the THC concentrations in cannabis. Concentrations as high as 40, 50, and even 60% have been found. And yet, Bill C-45 does not address this issue at all. Bills C-45 and C-46 have major flaws, and their application risks sowing chaos in provincial and municipal administrations. And this is why we always have a good example. We have a good example of growing at home. Bill C-45 sets out an offense if more than 4 plants are cultivated in a home. In Quebec, the National Assembly, in its bill, in Section 9, has formally banned anyone from growing cannabis for home use. The government of Quebec says that there is no question about that it allowing home growth. Recently, in an article in the Devoir titled "Home Cannabis Growth Cultivation, Quebec puts Ottawa on guard. Bill C-45 is permissive in the sense that if the provinces wish to equip themselves with more restrictive rules about home growing, they are free to do so, but there are limits to this. I would like the minister to tell us how she can impose limits other than through an act or regulations. What limits is she talking about? Naturally, the government of Quebec responded that it was convinced to act as was its right and that it had legal opinions to support its position. It is quite obvious that everything will be brought before the courts. Nothing to help the citizens with understanding the rules. Yet, during her speech on C-45 in the other place on May 30th, she said this, and I quote, "Generally speaking, the provinces and territories would be responsible for the retail and distribution. They would also be able to impose any other restrictions that they deem appropriate in collaboration with the municipalities, and they could set other rules concerning cannabis cultivation, home cultivation, particularly by lowering the number of plants that residents would be authorized to grow and by restricting the places where they would be allowed to consume cannabis." End of quote. Dear colleagues, the government says that it wishes to protect the health of youth by limiting their access to cannabis. And how is it doing so? It wants to authorize home cultivation of up to 4 plants without limiting the height of those plants or limiting the THC concentrations. Imagine the following scene. A youth of age 19 decides to grow 4 plants at home. This same youth has 2 brothers, age 17 and 15. Can someone explain to me how, in this example, the Liberal government would restrict the access to cannabis of the youth under the age of 18? Police officers showed me photos of cannabis plants seized during a raid. These plants were as tall as an apple tree, and their production capacity was unimaginable. In short, the possibility of growing cannabis plants at home makes it impossible to control quality, control the THC concentration, the sales price on the market, the accessibility to youth, the traceability of cannabis, and health warnings, the production near school zones and high-risk areas. The logical solution would be to ban home cultivation. Even veterinarians are worried about animal health, but the government isn't concerned about youth accessing them at home. Honorable Senators, I cannot believe that the government, by legalizing cannabis use, is really looking at this as a public health and safety issue. You will see, honorable senators, that with this bill, we have before us a huge challenge trying to cover all of the angles that might arise, evaluating all of the issues tied to it. highlighting the many flaws and assessing our options about the possibility of amending it to attenuate the damaging impacts on our society, but above all on youth, and amending it without creating incongruities.
For example, yesterday at the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, when we questioned officials from the Department of Health and those from the Department of Justice on the incongruities of the $200 fines that are connected with the height of the plants, that is not set out in the bill, they replied that at the beginning there was a standard for the height in the bill, but that the House of Commons amended the bill to take that out, which they had not foreseen, and therefore the incongruity of the $200 fine. In order to demonstrate that the government has taken into account the impact of the legalization of cannabis on drivers, the government tabled Bill C-46 to deal with this problem at the same time as C-45. But the study of this bill is currently before the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and it has serious flaws. As Senator Batters emphasized in her speech on C-45 last Tuesday, constitutional, operational, and many other problems. It seems to me that our police forces have to be properly trained and given the tools to adequately or properly face the problems that we're facing under C-45. In this regard, Minister Fournier seemed to be saying the same thing in his letter to the Minister of Justice on February 23rd. He said, in conclusion, we have to reiterate the importance of delaying the coming into effect of the federal legislation until we have proper scientific equipment that is available. We're talking about road safety and the safety of people. Still talking about people driving under the influence of some substances, neither C-45 nor C-46 addresses the problem of drivers of public transport. How could we explain that despite some air and rail accidents that are connected to conductors or drivers who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol over the last few years, that the government has done absolutely nothing in this regard? I remind you that the Transportation Safety Board, in a report on November 2nd, 2017, was recommending changes following an air crash where alcohol was involved. In C-46, we introduced a concept of random controls, random testing, or mandatory testing, according to the term used in the bill, not only for the drivers of vehicles involving alcohol. Nowhere is there any mention of random testing for drugs, and even worse, for drivers of public transit. If someone decided to test an airline pilot after the landing and he feels that he is under the influence of some substance, it would be impossible to have random testing done before the pilot gets on board. And this lack of a will to act is just shocking to me. In the United States, such tests for employees in sensitive positions such as airline pilots, locomotive engineers, and heavy truck drivers and people working in the nuclear industries has existed for at least 10 years. And what about the other issues related to the labor market? How can employers know how to act with employees who are consuming during their hours of work, at lunch, in the morning, or at dinner time? This problem exists already. It's not a new one. But the legalization of cannabis will make the use of cannabis common. And in fact, I think the debate around the legislation has already had this effect, in my opinion. I said it at the outset. Personally, I believe that we should vote down this bill, which is not well drafted. and we should do it at second reading and oblige the government to redo its homework to table a new bill that takes into account all of the issues. The experiences that we've seen in the United States could be examined, but we should never forget that Canada is the first and only country in the world who wants to legalize consumption of marijuana for people under the age of 21. And above all, we have to rely on what science has taught us in terms of the ravages caused by drug consumption for the health of our populations. And when I talk about that, we'll also have to have a very particular sensitivity to Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples who are particularly affected by the scourge of over-drug consumption.
Current policies have and are causing irrevocable affliction to Indigenous communities. This is one reason why the current government is seeking to adopt and implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Part of this declaration is the right to self-determination. For this reason, I want to highlight a few statements by Regional Chief Isadore Day at the Health Committee hearings in September of the last year. He said, First Nations are not prepared to deal with the ramification of Bill 45. In fact, he had, does Canada even know the full impact of cannabis? Chief Day also reminded the committee that American Indian tribes were negatively impacted when Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis. He reiterated that one of the biggest concerns that First Nations have with Bill C-45 is the health and safety of our peoples. He cited statistics that cannabis is the second most abused substance among Indigenous people. In Ontario alone, he added that 33 million is needed to treat First Nation with drugs and alcohol addictions. He concluded by stating, there appears to be more questions than answers. This leads First Nation in a compromised state leading into an accelerated timeline. Yet, Mr. Blair said in September 12, it is important that we focus on getting this job done as quickly as we are able. I simply do not see the urgency, especially in light of the Chief Day's concerns. Unlike fentanyl that causes, on average, 4 deaths a day in Canada, no one has died from a marijuana overdose.
Honorable Senators, I would invite you to vote against this bill at second reading. If, however, this is not the will of senators, I invite the committees that will be studying it and pre-studying it to carefully consider the mitigation measures that we could bring to Bill C-45, including the date of its coming into effect, the legal age for cannabis use, the contributions to tax havens through the commercialization of cannabis, and essential preventions that should precede the legalization of cannabis, random testing for drivers of public transport or high-risk employees, the level of concentration of THC in cannabis, and the limits to the production at home, and as well as significant clarifications in other parts of the bill. Monitoring at the borders, free access in neighboring countries and for friends, the publicity, the traceability, the impacts on the labor market, the price offered on the black market, and finally, the realities for Aboriginal people and people who hide behind legal businesses. So many questions and so few answers. And in the wake of all of these questions, I would add a final one. Was all this really necessary? In summary, I think that senators will wonder if the legalization of cannabis will really help our nation to move forward, but to make us stronger collectively and ensure that our country continues to evolve for the better. I would have liked the minister tell us that she had studied what countries like Norway have done, who have the lowest consumption rates among youth. I would have liked the government to study the best possibilities rather than the worst. I would have liked to see inspiration from the best and not the worst. I would have liked to see the government invest, as in they did in Norway, in cultivation of intellectual and sports pursuits rather than doing this. I can hardly believe that young Canadians will be guinea pigs for the rest of the world. Canada becoming a research lab used by all of the other Western countries. At the beginning of my speech, I spoke about the precautionary principle that government must use. This duty of using the precautionary principle is essential when we're looking at these kinds of realities and we're looking at subjects that we really don't know well. Honorable senators, to agree with the goal of reducing consumption amongst youth and eliminating organized crime is one thing, but if the only solution the government's proposing doesn't work, and that 5 years down the road the finding is that the government was wrong and that the situation has gotten worse, what will we do? Will we be able to turn the clock back? No. This is a one-way street. It's like a lobster trap, if you will. All of the speeches that we've heard, or almost all of them, have raised significant concerns and many questions regarding the legal use of cannabis. The duty to be careful should be our guide, and with this specific case, C-45, faced with so many uncertainties and unknowns, faced with so many questions without answers, we recommend not passing this bill and to send the government back to do its homework. And please, Mr. Trudeau, be inspired by the best in the world and not the worst. Thank you.